All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on a Wednesday. So, right in the middle of everyone's work week. I have Ash Oliver here today with me from the Maze team. I'm Emily. I am the community manager from Designlab. And today we're really excited to bring you a presentation on how rapid testing accelerates growth. Ash has a really exciting presentation for us. So, really quickly, I'm just going to drop some logistical information. So, yes, say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Feel free to connect with everyone here. And then if you do have questions about the presentation at any point, feel free to toss them in the questions tab. I will be off camera fielding questions about Designlab, and we do have Naomi from the Maze team as well. She's also hiding in the chat, so she's going to be helping field questions related to Maze in the chat and in the questions tab as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Ash so he can introduce himself and kind of what we're diving into today, and then I'll let him take it away.
Awesome. Very cool. Let me get my sharing here.
And for anyone wondering, yes, this will be recorded. You should receive an email after this letting you know the recording is available, but we will also have this uploaded to our YouTube channel in case you want to share this out or, you lose the recording, whatever it is. It will always be there for you.
All right. Can you see everything okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Wonderful. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the opportunity to not only represent Maze, but to speak on a topic that I am really passionate about. And ultimately, what I wanted to just kind of do first is introduce myself, just so you kind of know a little bit about my background and how I found myself talking about this topic. So I'm one of the design advocates at Maze, and I really like to describe kind of my fusion passion between design and data. I have formerly worked at some startups that were really focused on data and machine learning. And so I am really passionate and excited by data visualization and how we communicate with data. And of course, how that kind of stems into and fuels design. Given my background in kind of growth and sales environments within startups, I have a really deep understanding and kind of experience set in building businesses and specifically building them creatively. And so if you ever want to, kind of find me on Twitter or LinkedIn and have a conversation about design, I'm always game for that. I'm very much obsessed with design, as many of the books behind me that you can see. I reference being a book hoarder because I'm actually going to provide you some sources, some book titles at the end that I think would be really helpful. They were very informative to me in regards to the topic matter, but also might be intriguing to you if you're interested in design and design growth specifically. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention because of the audience here is I'm familiar with Designlab, was familiar with it before I joined Maze. And as I mentioned, I previously had a sales career. And I think that's a pretty unique path into design. It's not one that's pretty typical. And so I think as we start to see more designers entering into the space and the diversity of their kind of experiences and roles before design, I think it's an interesting experience to bring in some of the kind of business understanding into the design field. So that'll kind of help set the stage for where a lot of this opinion and ideas come from as far as this presentation. I also want to say that there will be a couple of COVID references here. One being that I just recently getting over a pretty deep sickness here. So bear with me with the brain fog. I'm still kind of coming out of the sickness. Thankfully, it was not COVID, but there will be a couple of nods to COVID in here. So very, very timely. So for an agenda, what we're going to do is, first I want to just kind of open up the landscape of what testing and research look like today. I think it's important to understand where we are as an industry and kind of practice in order to understand what the path forward in the future looks like. Then we'll talk about what is rapid testing. Again, kind of a nod to COVID, but rapid testing in general and kind of how we think about the practice. We're going to talk about Maze specifically because Maze is a rapid testing platform. And so it very much is the transition point from where we've kind of seen research and testing in previous to kind of where product teams are headed in the future. Then we'll finish up by talking about how you can actually unlock growth at your organization or on your team through design, and taking it one step further, how you're able to actually champion a culture of learning and experimentation across your organization. So to kick it off, what is user research? Well, as defined by the Nielsen-Norman group, which if you're not familiar with those two gentlemen, I would certainly recommend checking this out. It's a really great expertise in the field. And as far as user research, really when you're kind of looking to understand your users more deeply and from more of a behavioral landscape, really it kind of is broken up into three main pieces. The strategy to understand kind of where the path and the North Star lie. The execution, so how do we actually optimize and tailor our decisions across that research path, and then improving how we're understanding users to actually inform our designs, our products, our messaging. And assessing it is all around being able to benchmark this along the way. So we kind of strategize to understand what this looks like as a field. We execute against proper methods and methodology in improving usability, and then assess things as we move along. It's a very iterative process, and user research, it really incorporates a myriad of instrumentation and methodology in order to become user-centric and user-obsessed. We see organizations that do this really well, and we see organizations that don't. And so ultimately, it's the goal and belief that your users are the ones that hold the keys to understanding. And so the kind of traditional path, if you think about this over the last 10 years specifically, when we're looking at the workflow and the process of being able to build customer-facing experiences, whether that be a product or marketing copy, whether that's an application. Ultimately, what this typically look like is the waterfall method. You may have heard of this method before, and typically this is very siloed and kind of triaged as you move through the process, scoping out those requirements, then starting to formulate your designs, then obviously handing that off to development for engineering. Then testing is typically kind of that fourth piece in the process, usually where QA or quality assurance takes place, and then you deploy. And the problem with this process is that this is typically not how most teams or organizations today build products anymore. And the real kicker is that testing is left way down the path, the process, and renders all of those insights too late in the game. So teams are typically left with learning way too little, way too late. And you can see here with the requirements, the design and development stages, there's a lot of time and resourcing and money that goes into that process just to come down to the testing part of the process and find out that perhaps there were other decisions that should have been made, or mistakes that have been that have occurred, or maybe your product is not necessarily going to deploy as well as intended. And so you have to kind of backpedal through design and development to make any of those changes before development. And that's where you get that outcome at the end. And usually that testing part of the process can sometimes be very time intensive and cumbersome. And obviously with deployment schedules, teams are typically hamstrung in between development and deployment. So testing is oftentimes overlooked. And so what we see now is really more of that agile process where teams are testing and learning in more of an iterative process, where you have more collaboration between design and development, that the process is more cyclical, and that you run through this testing and learning environment in more of a along the way journey instead of a destination towards the end. And so this part of the process, obviously, you're able to learn more frequently, make changes more in more of an agile instance, and also be able to understand these outcomes before deployment. Now, we know that data-driven design organizations or design organizations in general will outperform their competitors. We know that user experience is important, especially for all of the folks on this call. We understand that it is a competitive differentiator to have a design-led organization. But a data-driven organization is one that also helps inform design. So design and data should go hand in hand. And by doing so, you're able to really eclipse those competitors. We can see here, even by the report through McKinsey, that as a comparison, organizations that foster this design-driven kind of environment and that really are implementing design strategies, growing their design teams in part of their organizations, are able to, as much of 2x, outperform their competitors. So we know that design is an important business metric. We know that design is important to organizations. We can very clearly and evidently, in a really quick fashion, be able to identify the companies that are design-centric versus not design-centric, or user-focused versus not. But really being able to steward that good design and design-informed practices within teams means that there should be an element of research and data-driven decision-making. And data-driven decision-making happens through research. We cannot make a data-informed decision if we don't have the kind of understanding, the foundation for being able to make those critical insights. So 8 out of 10 people within the design field agree that user research and testing is critical to be able to make those design decisions. Yet over 70% of teams don't do research. So why is that? Well, mostly teams rely on a moderated one-on-one kind of research methodology. If you think about kind of the spectrum, there's more of the kind of moderated versus unmoderated side of the coin. Moderated obviously being the ones where it's more of that labs interview kind of style. And that's really difficult because it takes a lot of time to be able to complete any of those sessions. Obviously coordinating and finding those individuals to meet with on a one-on-one basis, scheduling, actually holding and facilitating the session, and then doing any of the kind of extrapolating of those insights on that one-on-one basis takes a lot of time and is very costly. So 55% of teams that have research even allocated as kind of a resource or a budget don't have that much to actually produce. They don't have that much money to spend on research. As I mentioned, because it is so costly and does take up a lot of time. So that compiled with the fact that teams are typically hamstrung by the fact that they don't have very much expertise in the organization. They might have one UX researcher per 1,000 developers. You can see that the breadth of testing or the breadth of how often this kind of environment could take place gets bottlenecked by just the sheer number of individuals that are able to do so. And the worst part about this is that the results that are typically rendered from these types of moderated sessions are typically not that actionable or quantifiable. We typically see that in a moderated sense of user research, that these results are more on the qualitative type of spectrum, which provide great insights, but don't necessarily provide any of that data. And so if you think about, kind of the understanding of good design and what makes good versus bad design, ultimately we should be thinking about not how expensive good design is, but what the cost and implications of bad design is. And really the golden ticket in being able to avoid bad design is through research. So that leads us to what is rapid testing. I told you there would be jokes. It is not this kind of rapid testing, although I had to go through one of these just yesterday, so this is very fresh in my mind. But rapid testing is really about a framework, and this is where every decision is made with users in mind. And you'll oftentimes hear, user-centric companies or user-focused companies or user obsessed companies. If you're familiar with like Zappos, for example, they really championed their kind of ethos at their company by being user obsessed. We know that this is important. Doing so at scale is what's difficult. And so the goal ultimately is to remove all of the guesswork, the kind of hypotheses or assumptions that we might have in building the products or experiences, and instead rely and ensure that we have user data, actual quantifiable, accessible information about our users, their desires, their behaviors at every step of the process. Not just late down in the end of the process before we're about to ship, but at every point in the process. And so when you think about kind of the construction of user researchers to designers, user researchers to engineers, rapid testing really kind of breaks that open and says that it's not about actually making everybody a researcher, but instead enabling research as a practice to happen across every department. So if you're a product manager or a product marketer or a designer or even a stakeholder, how are these individuals able to be equipped with the ability to run research and do so at scale and very quickly? So ultimately, it can be broken down into kind of 4 main phases: the exploration phase, the define phase, the validate phase, and the assessment phase. And each one of these steps will contain a variety of inputs. And I want you to think about this in kind of a broad, more abstract practice, because this is going to ultimately be a little bit more specific depending upon the company, the product, the particular project that you might be working on. But ultimately, rapid testing can really fall into these 4 main phases. So exploration is really about that discovery process. How are we able to understand who we're actually building for, designing for? What are those, what does the market look like? What does that landscape look like? Getting the broad strokes down of that exploration phase in order to inform the definition. That's really important. A lot of teams will kind of do exploratory work, but don't have that informed by design data, don't have that informed by testing or user research. And so their definition may be off from the very beginning. So exploration is key to beginning through user research in order to ensure that we're defining our problems and goals correctly. That defined state automatically kind of rolls into that designing process. We're able to define the solutions by understanding what we garnered out of that exploration phase. And that brings us into validation. Once we have some of that defined, whether that's a low fidelity prototype to a high fidelity prototype, if it's marketing copy, if it's a low fidelity landing page, ultimately the output isn't necessarily the important piece. It's being able to take whatever that manifestation is and be able to validate it in the hands of your real audience or users. That validation process obviously is where the myriad of testing and research kind of methodology or instrumentation takes place. There's, as I mentioned, a lot of different types of testing that can take place. It's really dependent upon the project and kind of how you're looking to steward those insights. But validation is all about being able to test the edges, understand where something lands short, where something succeeds, being able to understand that and pinpoint that with data is an important piece of the process. And then being able to extrapolate those insights to make the next part of the decision-making is all through that assessment. And I think where teams typically have a lot of struggle is in the, kind of facilitating the actual testing process, that validation part of the framework, and then assessing it. How do I actually make insights from what was tested? What kind of data was produced? And that's where Maze comes in. And obviously, I'm incredibly passionate about what Maze does and how this is kind of helping to make a turn in the market, taking user research from something that was traditionally done in more of that labs kind of style and more of that one-on-one qualitative environment to more of a rapid remote testing process that fuels that decision-making. So it's no longer just about being able to conduct, rapid research, but being able to do so often in such an iterative process that we're able to rely on our decision making. We know that our decisions are coming from a data informed and a user informed place. And so, as I mentioned, this could be anything from building and designing products to your go-to-market strategies, creating campaigns, producing content. The real emphasis here is that this should be collaborative, that rapid testing shouldn't just be about UX design. It should incorporate the experience that any customer or user would encounter. So building products through marketing, through sales, and how we talk about our product or our market fit, all of this, it is encompassed by rapid testing. And so it's really a collaborative process across many types of roles within your organization. And how do you actually do that? Well, specifically within Maze, remote testing is autonomous. And especially, and again, I told you COVID was going to come up multiple times here. This year in particular, you actually see that research has kind of had the biggest change over the course of the design industry this year, because a lot of those teams were typically relying on those one-on-one sessions or even guerrilla kind of testing out in the market. And so now, with that being removed from the equation, we really can't get in front of our users in the same kind of face-to-face environment that we could at a former point. Remote testing in an autonomous environment is critical, that we're able to test anywhere and anytime across a kind of a seamless process to be able to really understand and engage with those users. The important part there as well is that when you think about, again, the labs environment, more of that qualitative assessment through one-on-one interviewing, is that you're only able to garner however much you're able to interview. And 1 to 3 to 5, even 10 interviews is not nearly as substantial as being able to remotely test in an unmoderated fashion across hundreds, if not thousands of users. So that brings us into those actionable insights where we're able to see not only the kind of maximum of data insights that are garnered out of the product because we're able to test with more users, but we're able to do that in a much faster environment. So what would have potentially taken 3 weeks to a month minimum now is able to be accomplished in hours. And that allows us to not only do so at scale and do so more often, but be able to fuel or pipeline that data into those decisions at every stage of the process. So it really democratizes design and testing beyond just the actual user researchers themselves. So when you think about, kind of what Maze is able to kind of technically facilitate, this is really the kind of product decisions, as I mentioned, but being able to do so across your own users predominantly. So if you work for an organization, whether that's a SaaS organization, a B2C or a B2B company, ultimately there are some users or consumers of your product or experience. And so being able to connect you with those users or supplement users through Maze's panel to be able to test and validate these decisions early in the process and garner those quantitative metrics is really all about being able to utilize Maze for that expertise, for that ability to really solidify those decisions. So when you think about Maze as kind of the overall spectrum in the process, it really starts with that strategy and in Maze discovery. So just like we looked at the kind of user testing and rapid testing and the framework that happens there, Maze really kind of falls into every one of those parts of the process. So Maze discovery is being able to really garner those insights at the kind of top of the process, being able to understand who and what you're designing for, to be able to inform how you actually create. The execution follows through with that validation of the test, the actual data capturing, and being able to understand how users are actually interacting with that product or prototype. And then, of course, assessing is all about being able to understand the insights that are then garnered. So how do we understand the analytics? What do we know from the experience that was conducted? So the Maze report actually is able to generate these insights not only in a user intuitive way, so it makes data more accessible, because oftentimes as designers or even just general individuals, we don't necessarily always love math. I think that's maybe a unique attribute sometimes when folks really love data. It's oftentimes messy, it's hard to work with, it's hard to extrapolate insights, it's unreliable. And so Maze allows this to be not only achievable at the beginning of the process, but being able to actually make sense of what you're able to achieve, what you're able to actually garner through data. So how does this relate to growth design? Well, ultimately, what is growth design? It's not necessarily talked about at length in the industry. I think it's a smaller niche group of individuals that really talk about growth design. I'm specifically very keen on growth design because I come from the business side of the house. I'm very used to thinking about in terms of metrics and KPIs and how we're able to actually validate things through data. And so data and business metrics are very much a part of my kind of ethos in my previous career. But growth design is really just about the intention to grow the business and to do so in a focused way. So everybody has this goal, especially if you work at a startup, but that doesn't go away once you're a publicly traded company or a huge enterprise. Everybody is working towards that same goal of growing the business. It doesn't always even have to be in the growth as revenue, but there's some element of growth at any kind of group or team. And so everybody really has the capacity to steward growth design. Typically what we see is that this is usually part of the experience facing team, the customer experience facing team. So the folks that are on the product and experience side. But the foundation of design or growth design is really about data. And you're only as good as the data you're able to capture. So data really, in this sense, around growth design is about actionable, high quality, reliable, and accessible data. How you're able to capture that is where teams are still looking to kind of inform that process, inform that instrumentation through tools, and tools like Maze in particular. Growth design is really about, again, that validation of ideas, being able to quantify experiences. So not just relying back on our hypotheses or assumptions or the kind of qualitative information that we might have or anecdotes that we might have. Those things are great fodder, but the quantifiable data is what allows us to be able to really see it in a clear-cut way how we're able to pivot or make better decisions. Ultimately, I think of growth as a skill set and methodology. As I mentioned, you can be really any individual and be focused on growth. It's just about how you foster that skill set and methodology. Some of the ways in which you might be able to do that is through like A/B testing or coordinating experiments. If you're in marketing, you might look at testing or tweaking within marketing attribution, or if you're in product, that might look like product analytics. Again, my focus here isn't to necessarily go into all of the ways in which you might be able to test, but instead think about the experimentation as more of a culture and a practice. So even if you're in a sales role, for example, speaking of my previous experience, I've spun up lots of tests in sales and be able to report back to the business, why did I do the test? How did I do the test? And what happened as a result of the test? That is growth design. And it should be very compelling for both you as well as the teams in which you work in to talk about the importance and the value of this, because it goes right back to what we were talking about at the beginning. That process, that waterfall process where we learn at the end is antiquated. What this really fosters is reducing that time at the beginning of the process, the resources, the money, the risk, all of that happens in kind of the building phase, and instead ensure that we're maximizing our time and resources and money because we're making decisions through this growth and testing lens. So how are you able to kind of pull this into your organization, especially if this is one that, either is a new organization or maybe is a organization that has typically not conducted user research or much testing, or maybe has fallen prey to the old guard of testing and perhaps doesn't see its value or think that it is maybe too time intensive or too resource constraining? Well, ultimately, it's about being able to share this across your company and really kind of advocate on behalf of it. And the more you know, the better you are, the more informed you can be at any part of your role or experience. So these are just some of the things that I think would be helpful in terms of being able to champion this kind of culture of testing and learning. The first thing is really about taking it on as a self-initiative, self-study kind of process. If this excites you, if you're excited by being able to design alongside this kind of growth mindset and data orientation, you don't have to necessarily make a pack or a club with a bunch of other individuals. You can kind of stand alone in that. You can take your own self-study path and kind of learning and understanding this more so that you can kind of be the voice of that internally. Sometimes that might feel a little isolating, but personally I've found that the more kind of passionate and deep dive study you do yourself, the more of a kind of ripple out effect that can have. Sometimes people won't necessarily take the initiative if they're not interested, but once they see kind of the glimmer of other people and what they're able to accomplish, you can kind of bring more of those people into the fold. And the way that you do that ultimately is through sharing. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't necessarily just be studying this in a self-facilitated process. Looks like I lost. There we go. Can't necessarily just be doing this in a vacuum, but instead we need to share this more broadly. So take what you are studying and learning and share that. It's a really easy way to be able to post something to Slack, or even hold a lunch and learn session, have a results review session where you talk about the experiment that you ran and then talk about what you learned. The other way that you can do this is really by honing in or trying to produce strong skills for question asking. We should all, as designers in particular, but even more broadly, be really focused on the questions that we ask. Not necessarily the answers that we receive, that's important, but the questions that we ask in order to achieve those answers. I like to think about experimentation as a habit and measuring as a mindset. So these two things really go hand in hand. You can't experiment if it's something that you're not doing often. Experiments should be done in an iterative fashion, and we should be always thinking about how we quantify our results. How do we understand our results and measure those results? So experimentation as a habit and measuring as a mindset. And then the other kind of last kind of tip that I would provide is learning about the business. And I think this is actually shown over the last couple of years that designers' main focus, their skill set that they're looking to hone, in addition to all of the hard and soft skills that are focused on the actual design practice, is being better business understanders, being able to understand the business goals, what the business teams do, how they're able to understand those metrics, how those metrics rely or relay into the business and their kind of health of the business. This is all really important insight that you can start with right within your own organization or team by just buddying up with someone that's on the business side of the house. And I'll leave you kind of with a quote here that the single biggest driver of business impact, I believe, is the strength of an organization's learning culture. And we see this in other places, like in people within the HR space or in talent acquisition, or when you're interviewing for a company. Oftentimes it will come up as to like, what are you learning, or how do you learn? And self-learner, self-study, these are all really strong attributes of individuals that can provide a lot of business value. But the collective experience of that across your organization, that learning culture, goes hand in hand with how you're able to actually champion these kind of testing and experimentation types of endeavors within your company. If you have that learning culture, both internally and externally, this is something that really is able to drive a lot of business impact. So this was a few weeks ago. This is actually my desk, and these were the kind of three books that I would strongly recommend if you're interested in growth design, in testing, in user research. These are the kind of three books that I would run into a burning building for. There's many more that I think are helpful, especially if you're one that are either looking to get into a startup or are in a startup organization yourself. Running lean, lean startup, and Upstream in particular are three really good books that are focused more on that size and scale of business organizations. But these are all things that can be brought into a larger enterprise as well. So I leave you with these sources just as reference of kind of how this presentation was pulled together, what informed my thinking as I put together this presentation, but also how you can learn more if you're intrigued. So I want to thank you so much for your engagement, for any of the questions that you've provided. We're definitely able to run into the Q&A now. Let me flip over my screen. And
Thanks, Ash.
yeah.
That was awesome. So we actually do have quite a few questions. Naomi's tackling some of them in the questions tab, but there's actually a few that I think we can address out loud. And the first one is actually directed to you specifically, and it's from Jennifer. Her question is, when did you realize that you enjoyed research? And do you currently do a lot of design work now, or are you more focused on research?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so as I guess the time in which I realized that I was really interested in research came in a personal endeavor. If I were to kind of take my computer and move you around my apartment, you would see piles and piles and piles of books. I told you I'm a book hoarder. It's something that I've done ever since a little kid, and so I'm endlessly curious. And when I'm curious about something, I research it to its end. And so naturally, kind of being super enthusiastic and passionate about design, research kind of, fell right behind it, because as I was studying design, that was, kind of opening up, my own self-study and research practices. So now as a design advocate, I really see research as kind of one of the pillars of my role. And by doing so, that's in, engaging in the community, engaging in what user researchers and designers and product managers are doing, and kind of really understanding the landscape and practice. So yeah, research is definitely a big pillar of what I'm intrigued by.
And I feel like if you call yourself an expert shopper, you're probably a really good researcher too. You just don't see it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? All right, cool. So next one is from Helena. Question is, how do you decide what metrics are your success metrics in the validate phase with no prior benchmarks? Great question.
Ooh, that is a really good question. Yeah, I would say, again, I would lean on collaboration. Try not to do this in a vacuum. If you're trying to pinpoint what those metrics are alone, it's you only have necessarily like one lens into that process. So I would say, again, if depending upon what your role is, I would buddy up with like my product manager or my designer or my researcher. Oftentimes, the researchers are the ones that have kind of that breadth of expertise, that really specialized knowledge, and so they'd be able to kind of help you set up that framework. But it's really going to be dependent upon every project and kind of who you have accessible to collaborate with. I would say, think about incorporating metrics that you then can not only test against, but then validate at the end of the process. So it should always be something that is measurable. Sometimes that'll be more qualitatively measured, sometimes more quantitatively measured. But I would say, yeah, make sure that you're not doing it in a vacuum. Be mindful of the actual project at hand and collaborate with the individuals that you can in order to really pinpoint what those are.
All excellent tips for sure. All right, next one is from Serena. I think this one's actually really good too, because a lot of our students might run into this issue. So the question is, how do you ensure or avoid participants from just randomly clicking parts of the prototype to get through the testing? In testing across Zoom, you can avoid this by having participants talk you through their process, but this can't be done on Maze. So how would you prevent this?
Yeah, great question. So the way that I would typically do that is by looking for outliers. There are ways in which Maze, the product and company, through our own panel, are able to identify these types of experiences with users and weed those out. So there's things that we do as a company to ensure that that doesn't happen. But whether you're using our panel or your own kind of users, there are always going to be some level of outlier. And so what I would do is kind of have a keen eye for that and weed those out. Hopefully your experiment or test doesn't include a large portion of those. Those are typically a handful at most. And so I would just eradicate those from the actual results entirely so that it doesn't skew the actual data. If you're looking to, kind of do this in a moderated session through Zoom, of course, you can kind of like oversee this a little bit more. I don't necessarily believe that in order to remove those outliers from the experience that you have to always oversee them, through a Zoom or moderated session. But there's an opportunity to potentially do both. One thing that we see quite often with teams that utilize Maze is that they might take the Maze test, deploy this to 50, 100 plus of their users in an unmoderated fashion, and then take 5 or maybe 3 users that they're going to spin up a Maze and Zoom session with, so that user is still taking the Maze, but they're doing so over Zoom. And now you have kind of the combination between the unmoderated versus the moderated, and then extrapolating any of those outliers that might have just kind of quickly clicked through your design. So I hope that's helpful.
I actually didn't even think about the fact that you could just do the Maze testing through Zoom. Like you can do it both without having to recreate the test. That is genius. Now I need to have my students kind of save some time and do it that way too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so the next one, this one's a juicy one. This is from Gabriella. How would you help a boss understand / convince them of the importance of testing when they would rather skip past the step to keep things moving? I feel like this is a story here all the time.
Yeah, it wasn't a big focus of this presentation. I definitely alluded to it because that is more common than not, and it's unfortunate. But remember that I think there's a couple of things that I would really lean on. First of all, especially if you're new in the organization or you're new to design, you have a unique opportunity and a unique voice to be able to ask questions and kind of provide your 2 cents. I'm someone that's native New Yorker, pretty direct, like to be on a soapbox about things that I'm passionate about. Sometimes that doesn't always feel comfortable to folks, but I would say, as you're interacting with your boss, I would take the note about asking good questions and be inquisitive. Ask him or her why that is. Did previous user research or testing go south? Did it take really long? Was it too time consuming and costly? Like, find out what the source of that why is for that person, so that then you can understand and then obviously provide a different solution. And being able to kind of understand where that person is coming from, I think will help inform how you recommend moving forward. But I think you should bolster your opinion and expertise more than maybe feels comfortable, and try to really be the voice of reason. And maybe if that boss doesn't want to do something big, see if they can at least give you the opportunity to run something on a smaller scale to prove a different experience for you. Just because something happened in previous that didn't work well and now is informing their decision making doesn't mean that they can't see what the possibilities look like if something else was tried. So yeah, be your own advocate for sure.
I feel like that alone is like a skill to be able to convince someone that it's worth the time, right? To do testing.
Well, don't forget that this is all about reducing risk, reducing time, reducing wasted money. If those things don't perk up that person's ears, you would probably find someone else that their ears would be perked up by that. So just sell the value for sure.
And really, in terms of mindset, it's thinking about it long term versus just short term. For us, I feel like we're always focusing on long term, and we're just thinking way down the line. So yeah, if definitely a skill to practice, but absolutely something to advocate for. All right. So next one is from Ashley, and question is: would you suggest that teams cross collaborate when testing? So doing a bit of market research and also usability testing together, or should these tests be done within each team?
Yeah, super great question. I think traditionally it has been done in a vacuum, and this is why growth design also exists as a practice, because each team has their own tool set, each team has their own testing, each team then has their own data and then insights, and very rarely are these things communicated or accessible across teams. And what a world it would be if your product marketers and your product managers and your designers and your researchers are all informed based on, kind of the same unionized and like democratized testing and insight. I mean, that there's so much to gain from cross-pollination in that way. It's just, I think we're coming out of an age where that wasn't done that way. Just as waterfall has shifted more into agile, we're going to see the same change happening with user research, where the old guard of that is not necessarily the most valuable anymore. And so collaboration across different team members and being able to steward tests together is vital. And a really easy way of being able to do that, it obviously, is through Maze, because that's one tool that I definitely know very well. But it allows you to be able to pull in those stakeholders and those different types of roles into one test, and not only collaborate on how to be able to inform that test, but then collaborate on what you all got out of it. So absolutely bring in those individuals as early as in the process as you possibly can, and try to make a little squad out of those different roles in order to test more effectively. Yeah,
for sure. I would, right? It's about alignment and transparency, and not getting those wires of communications crossed, or even just axed completely. You want to make sure that they stay open all the time.
Yeah.
All right. So next one, I feel like can have a variety of answers. So maybe we can tackle it from more of like a best practice or tips and tricks. But the question is, how do you decide what experiments to design? Does it tie back to an OKR or a metric that the company wants to drive for the quarter, or would it tie back to something else?
Yeah, that is a good question, and a pretty broad question. I feel like there's an art and a science to this. So the science being, more of the, kind of understanding of what instrumentation is available to you, and what instrumentation is going to work best. So like things like a 5-second test might be a really great test instrument for a particular type of outcome. Same thing with A/B tests, same thing with usability tests. Like there are going to be certain types of testing methodology that will work better for the use case and render a closer result to what you're looking for, or closer outcome to what you're looking for. And that might be a myriad of those things together. It might be just individualized testing like that. So that's kind of more of the science part. The art is knowing when and where to deploy that, and kind of how to craft that. And I think teams are getting really creative around how they engage with their users. I don't know if maybe I'm just like a unique bird and nerd on my own, but for the products that I use and love, I am like always a hand raiser for getting in front of their teams to talk about my experience. Whenever I get an email about like, would you be interested in taking a survey or interested in jumping on a call with a designer? I'm like, yes, if I care about this product, I have a vested interest in giving you my feedback. So I think that's more of the art part of it, is like understanding your users, understanding the correct scope of users to be able to deploy that kind of methodology or types of tests against. And I think that just, goes back to the project. What is, is it a particular type of deliverable that you're looking for as an output? Is it more, kind of open-ended and discovery-oriented, where it's a little bit more free-form? I think it would really depend on the project. But think about it in that kind of combination of art and science, and I think you'd find the right balance.
All right, next one I feel like is also just based on experience, because I feel like it does differ, but I think this one is intriguing. So question starts off with, I like signing up as a tester in order to learn about process, but I don't ever seem to get picked. And I'm guessing because I identify myself as a designer, do researchers avoid choosing other designers as testers?
Huh. I do not think so. I think that, at least in my experience, I can give a personal anecdote. So one of the like Fastco Design, the website Fastco, just recently went over the last year or so, went through like a new kind of positioning experience, and I got an email like from their user research team that wanted to engage with users of the site, and I obviously said yes, and I connected, and I was very forthcoming about being a designer. And that individual on that session in particular was really happy about the fact that I came from that experience and kind of world, because I was able to pull out maybe things that were more meaningful to me, that maybe other users didn't really focus on or didn't apply that lens within. And I think sometimes it's going to be based on like their audience. So they're looking for a particular, kind of makeup of individuals, so that they have a diverse, kind of panel and experience set to test against. And so maybe it wasn't specific, it wasn't a specific need to what they were looking for. But I definitely don't think that researchers should be discrediting or overlooking other designers. I think that that's a good vehicle for information. If you're ever curious, I'm not sure, kind of how you engage with this service that you're looking to provide feedback on, but I don't think it's I don't think it would be unwise to just send a note and kind of ask more questions. Again, asking questions are kind of the best path forward to insight. So I would say, if you're curious about it and they send you a note about being in the process and you don't get selected, I think there's no reason why you couldn't follow up and ask or express your interest in being involved in a different capacity.
Yep, for sure. And I think Naomi is tackling our last question, but I do want to loop back to one of our first questions that Naomi did answer, but I think would be great to address out loud. Do you recommend Maze as a good start for a company that has never really participated in consistent user research? If so, why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. I would recommend Maze at any point in the process, at any stage of company. And that's not just because I work for Maze, but because it truly is that flexible and accessible. I think especially for teams that maybe aren't coming from such a like structured practice before and are really starting to try to like implement and build the foundation, building blocks of testing and testing more often. Maze is a really low barrier of entry to do that. It works just as well in really large organizations that have a practice and a really defined, kind of methodology that they've utilized for years. But I definitely think for teams that are like just kind of entering into this and are trying to grow that skill set or practice at their company, Maze is a really great way to do it. And the thing about it is that you get results so quickly that it kind of like, it kind of inflames that like wanting to test more often, because the more insights you get, the more intrigued there is. It's kind of this flywheel effect. So I think it's a rewarding tool to use to kind of usher in that practice at the company if it hasn't been really implemented so far.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say that when I was a Designlab student, about 4 or 5 years ago, I do wish that Maze had existed, because at that time, Sketch was pretty much the only UX friendly tool out there, and that was it. You kind of had to like figure it out, piece everything together. So anytime I know I can advocate for Maze, I will. And if anything, it does make me more excited to do testing, because it's one less thing that I have to sit there and do and moderate, because I get so many great metrics out of it that I can actually see a heat map where people are clicking. Like I can actually understand user behavior and interaction without having to moderate any testing. So I think it's awesome. And you don't have to be awake for it. People can do it at midnight. It's awesome.
Yeah, I think we're really at the turning point. You know, if you think about the industry over the last 10 years, like designers were using like Illustrator and Photoshop for UX design way back in the day, and typically like we would kind of scoff at that now because of Sketch and, you know, Figma and Marvel and Envision. We've seen all of these design tools enter into the market for UX design. We haven't seen so much change in research and testing, and Maze is really spearheading that wave. And I think we'll see more of that from Maze. I think we'll see more of that from the industry. But I think you know, getting into the practice of testing and testing often, and then marrying that with how you're able to unlock growth opportunities, identify growth opportunities, is, I think, you know, a career builder, a focus and value at the company, and for your own, you know, kind of your own, you know, contribution to the team. And so Maze is just one way that you can incorporate that.
Yep, for sure. All right, cool. So we are at the end of our presentation. Thank you so much, Ash, for taking the time to answer all these questions. I think they were very, very insightful, very thought-provoking. And, you know, I feel like research is always just not appreciated enough. And I really, really wish that it was.
So undervalued, so underutilized.
I know.
Big opportunity for anyone here that, you know, that is looking to do that. I think that the grass is like nothing but green pastures. So it's definitely an exciting time.
Yeah, for sure. So we're wrapping up. This is recorded. Just a reminder that this is also going to go on our YouTube channel in case, you know, you want to kind of rewatch this and kind of get a list of those books that Ash had shared, and the second to last slide. So all those resources will be there. If you have any kind of requests on maybe another collaboration webinar, feel free to send that over to either Maze or myself on social media, on the Designlab account or Maze account. Something, you know, I'm sure we're very happy to put together in the future. But yeah, if anyone has any suggestions, let us know. If you have any questions or follow-up about this webinar, feel free to send them over to us as well. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again, Ash, and thank you, Naomi, for being in the chat, fielding questions for us, you know, through typed word. But yeah, thank you so much. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wednesday to everyone, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody's engagement. It's table stakes to say that I'm open to feedback, so please let us know. But thank you so much for all the participation.
And Ash is on Twitter too, and he's tagged us. We're all kind of now linked all over Twitter. So if you want to send him a message, tell him thanks yourself. I'm sure he'd appreciate that.
No, thanks.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you later.
Awesome. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.